doing your thing. And so there we go. Hey, let me introduce you properly. This is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and or listening to my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And today I'm talking with someone that I know because I do a grandchild pickup every day at a local school here in Massachusetts, and he gets his kids from school, and he is a professor and I am a writer, and I'm talking with historian and professor Jason Soko. And Jason is the author of many books. I'm going to just run through a few. Um, there goes Everything White Southerners in the Age of Civil Rights. Another book, All Eyes Are Upon Us, Race and Politics from Boston to Brooklyn. And one we're talking about today that I just finished reading and have notes prepared on it, The Heavens Might Crack, The Death and Legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. Originally, it was published by Basic Books and then has just been republished late last year by the University of Georgia Press, and I believe it's in paperback now. That's correct, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
And yeah, please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts and to my Substack, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. So anyway, let's get to the book because the only one of those three that I've read, and we'll talk about the body of your work and your interests in, I guess civil rights would be the overarching term. But to get back to The Heavens Might Crack, The Death and Legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. I'll open with this, and that is you have a quote. Let me see. I'll quote something from page 262 toward the end of your book that kind of, I was looking for something that would set your book up and get this conversation going. And here's a quote. Those who cite King as an example so often ignore his manifest commitment to civil disobedience. Their distortions reflect the fact that many Americans still have not reckoned with the actual King. Even those who brandish his legacy have little understanding of the causes for which he sacrificed. And I think of the various paragraphs that I could have pulled out of the book, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that one actually represents your book quite well in that it sets it up. It could have been something on the back. And I just want to add, I read your lecture you gave at Morehouse College a couple weeks ago, and that was something you sort of emphasized in that lecture as well, a similar point. So have I got that right? Does that kind of represent why you wrote the book in trying to fix that and try to introduce people to Martin Luther King Jr. as he actually was and what he really represents in American history, rather than this kind of, no pun intended, whitewash of kind of just we'll ignore the tough bits and just look at something where we can quote it on Martin Luther King Jr. Day or whatever in a way that flies well with everybody. So when you wrote the book, what misapprehension were you trying to correct, if you want to pin one down
Right.
for your reader?
Right. Well, thanks for that. I agree that that's a good quote to start the discussion off. That the heavens might crack is about the impact of King's assassination and death. It's sort of a social history of his death.
Hmm.
And um, one thing that interested me about this, well, I was looking for a new angle to write about King. There have been dozens of great biographies of King's life.
Yeah,
Taylor Lynch, David Garrow, Jonathan Eig just won the Pulitzer Prize for his biography. But all of those biographies basically end at the moment of his death, with King, famously on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. And
sure.
that's the moment that I wanted to begin with. And
Yeah.
by doing that, I could understand the impact he had on people, not just have another story of here's King in Montgomery, here's King in Albany, here's King in Birmingham.
Mhm.
So I wanted to try to broaden out and understand his influence, I thought, more widely. So that's
Mm.
that's one response. But then I want to get to the meat of what you said, which is how, yes, I think many Americans have misinterpreted King and in a couple different ways. The first is just often by reducing him to one speech on at the Washington Mall, the I Have a Dream speech. And further than that, reducing him to one line from that speech, which is the line that everyone knows, where King says that he longs for the day when his children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, that line has been regurgitated, every year and twisted by people, often by people on the political right, to try to say that King would be against affirmative action, where if you actually read anything else that he wrote or said, if you actually read the rest of that speech itself, he talks about, quote, the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. In that same 1963 speech, he talks about the whirlwind of revolt that will shake the nation if justice doesn't come soon. And that's 1963. And my book really begins in 67, 68, when King had become much more radical. By radical, I mean he had spoken out against the Vietnam War, against American imperialism, against America itself. He was losing faith in the country that he had been a firm believer in the American dream and the multiracial integrated country, democratic country. And he was losing faith in that promise by 67, 68. He was launching the Poor People's Campaign, which a lot of Americans claimed was communist. So by this point in his life, he was not known as the all-American hero that we know him as today. He was polarizing, he was controversial, he had a radical economic philosophy, he was anti-imperialist. So I think in a lot of those different ways, and we can go any of those directions that you want, but that's just as a starting point. In all those different ways, he was much more complicated than I think a lot of people understand. Can't hear you, Frank.
I muted myself a little bit there because I was shuffling through your book pages. But what I was going to say is that I think that if you look at the chapter heads of your book here, Losing King, the last prince of nonviolence, quote, he knew that millions hated King, roses for my soul, the world stands aghast, stop the shots, from outlaw to saint, conclusion, King in our time. I'm going to just sort of begin with that bit, the King in our time, and fast forward to something you have in your book, basically talking about Barack Obama and the very big reaction to the presidency of a Black man. In other words, here's the Black American who becomes the kind of fulfillment of the dream, if you want to put it that way. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, instead of that, 2 minutes later, you're looking at Trump as the backlash. And I'll just quote something from your book here, a little bit of length, because I think it opens up a good chunk of discussion here. I think this is from page 250 something. With the election of Barack Obama, King's struggle paved the way for America's first Black president, yet King's slaughter also presaged the other racial dynamic that shapes the United States in the early 21st century. It helped to usher in a world of racial hatred and political division. We as a society have yet to recover from that blow. The kind of hostility that bubbled to the surface in 1968 seems to have repeated 50 years later, often in even nastier forms. After King's death, African Americans took to the streets, some in violent revolt and others in peaceful and interracial marches. Many whites were fearful of African Americans and appalled by the protests in the streets more than they were outraged at King's assassination. And then you basically tie that in, very well, I think, to kind of the present tense, in that you bring us up to the period that elects Donald Trump. And let's start with King in the present tense and your take as a professor that teaches American history and has written 3 books basically on this subject in one way or another. of what I'll call the counter
Mhm.
revolution, the rise of the new white supremacy, very much tied to something that I've talked about a lot on this podcast because of my evangelical background, which is also the rise of white Christian
Mhm.
nationalism. So I think your book really gets into this in a way, because you talk very directly about the connection with Obama, but also the the reaction. So why don't you unfold that part of your book for us and your own ideas that may or may not be in the book, but I'd really like to pick your brain about this.
Sure. I mean, I started the research for this book, I think in 2013 or so.
Yeah,
So there you're at the beginning of Obama's second term.
yeah,
Obama's not only been elected and we have
yeah.
this racial breakthrough, he's been reelected. The American people have looked at this black president and evaluated him and said, okay, we're not just doing it one time for a symbolic breakthrough. He's going back to the White House. That to me was amazing and very uplifting.
Mm,
And I did the research through those 4 years of his second term. The book finally came out in 2018 for the
sure.
50th anniversary of King's death. By that time, yeah, Trump has capitalized on this. He has exploited this vicious white backlash, I think, which is in large part, but not solely, to a backlash to Obama's presidency, right? So
Yeah.
I mean so just in the time that I was doing the research on this book, I was basically living in two different Americas. The the two sides that we have, on the one side, there is this hope for a multiracial nation that I think Obama embodied to a lot of people. And then a black man in the White House was too much for a lot of the country, I think,
Mm,
to hide. There were a lot of things, of course, going on in the 2016 election. Also, that same segment of the country didn't want to elect a woman, particularly Hillary Clinton. They had great, deep hatred and disgust for her and the idea of her in the White House. So I think, there were a lot of issues that Trump rode into the White House for that first time. And it's also important to say that he never won as many votes as Hillary did either. He didn't win 50% of the country.
right.
So I think there are a lot of things going on. The passage that you started with, I do think that those two sides of the country have been in evidence for a while. If you look back in 1968, I think with King's death, there were still many Americans that hoped that the country would fulfill the sort of interracial dream of the mainstream civil rights movement, right?
Mm,
I think King's death helped to extinguish a lot of that dream and took away one of the last leaders who was still even talking about that.
mm,
And in his place, you had a lot of younger generation of Black Power leaders in terms of African Americans. And then, of course, the person who won the White House that year did so by exploiting a somewhat similar set of resentments than Trump did. And
yeah.
then Richard Nixon, his Nixon's strategist, Kevin Phillips, famously said the key to American politics is knowing who hates who.
Hmm.
Nixon figured out who hated who. He didn't want to talk about, LBJ's economic policies. He didn't want to have election about whether the Democrats or the Republicans were better for the middle class. He wanted to have an election about crime, law and order, hippie protesters in the streets, Black Panthers, and which segment of the country hated those people.
Yeah.
Basically. And I think that's the array of resentments that Trump is playing on, and he's doing it in a far more vicious way than even Nixon did. I mean,
Yeah.
Nixon was the supposedly respectable choice over George Wallace in that 68 election. There's nothing respectable about what Trump's trying to do. He's playing on the deepest fears and resentments and hatreds of a certain segment of America and trying to exploit those and ride those again into office. So that's my first response to sort of tying it into the
Mm.
present.
Well, there's another element too that sort of jumped off the page because of the context in which I'm reading your book, which is the 2024 election and the student demonstrations on campuses
Right.
right now. And that was the bit, and I think this came from let's see, page 130 to 131. It sounded as if it was sort of ripped from the headlines right now. So I think it's a good thing to put these things in perspective too. The confrontation at Columbia was 10 years in the making. In 1958, Columbia administrators hatched a plan to build a new gymnasium. They targeted a 2-acre patch of land in Morningside Park and negotiated a sweetheart deal with New York City to rent the parkland. In a hulking structure built along the slope of the park, Columbia would erect one gym for the Ivy League undergraduates and another for the residents, mostly Black and Latino, of Morningside Heights and Harlem. The plan was consistent with Columbia's recent expansion into adjoining neighborhoods, in which it had eminent domain to relocate Puerto Rican and African American students. And then you go on to describe the kind of the history of the protests at Columbia, how they then began to unfold in May 1966 with Percy Sutton and Basil Peterson, two Black legislators known for their moderation and interracial approaches, introduced bills to repeal the 1960 law that originally granted the land to Columbia, and so forth.
Mhm.
It just seems to me that one characteristic of this book of yours is that you are kind of describing a series of moments of chaos, the
Mhm.
assassination of King, the following demonstrations, the slide toward more violent protests, the kind of reaction of having gun control all of a sudden because now blacks are going to be violent. Maybe it's and King has been assassinated, so maybe it's time to clip the wings of the NRA a little bit. There's so much ferment in that period
Mhm.
that it really echoes with a lot of the ferment in our own period. Campuses, lots of things going on, commencements being canceled. You're a professor, you teach history. What is your perspective on the similarities, but also the vast differences between, say, the Nixonians
Mhm.
period of history and the way he was using race, and you
Right.
have to know who to hate, and now Trump, you have to know who to hate. Different cast of characters, different issues, but there have to be some cyclical similarities in just like, hey, this is what America's about. This is how we roll. It just seems to me, at least, there's something you might want to look at there.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. And I haven't really revisited my chapter on the campus protests
Right,
right now, which is really interesting to think about because of course, the culmination of the Columbia story that you started to tell
right.
is spring of 1968.
Sure.
Students took over the administration
Yeah,
buildings. They took over multiple buildings, and the New York City riot police came in and brutalized them and threw them off the campus, which
yeah,
is quite similar to what recently happened at Columbia and several other campuses,
yeah,
UCLA, USC, and my own UNH, where just a few dozen protesters tried to erect camps or erect encampments on the main lawn, and the New Hampshire riot police came out and dragged them out and arrested them, the
mm,
students who were peacefully protesting. And I think so in our moment, no one knows how the politics of this issue will play, but we know how it played in 1968,
yeah.
which this played right into Nixon's message of law and order, that he
You,
was going to bring, that he was going to bring law and order to a chaotic, out of control society, one where you have these sort of as dirty students stealing the headlines, and he was going to marshal the voices of the silent majority
yeah,
and and then speak for them. There's a lot of, as you say, there's a lot of similarities and a lot of differences right now. I mean, it seems to me the Vietnam War issue was a little bit more clear cut than the Israel Gaza issue, just
sure.
as a war,
Yeah,
mm, where by that point it was obvious that that the US just shouldn't um, be in Vietnam.
mm,
Um, Israel-Gaza is a little more complicated, not that complicated. They've killed what, 30,000 some Gazans by this point. Also, it's not complicated that students should be able to peacefully protest. And I think that's
Yeah,
the
but
main.
there's also a little bit of a difference that I'm going to throw in because I'm of that generation of the 68. By the way, I had a friend who had flown to Paris for the first time, who was my age at the time, which meant he was 17, 18 years old. And he got to Paris, went downtown in 1968, where they were building barricades and rioting, and the whole of Paris
Yeah.
had been shut down. Ran down a street, ran around a corner right into a police charge, was immediately knocked unconscious by a French riot policeman who clubbed him over the head, woke
Mhm.
up in a hospital, spent a month in a French hospital, flew back to the States. That was his welcome to Paris visit. Very, very much part of the temper of the times.
Yeah.
But anyway, to get to one little point, there is a tiny difference that I'll point out between the students now on the campuses demonstrating about the Gaza-Israeli conflict, and that is that back in my day, 68, the demonstrations would be carrying on often by students and or their girlfriends who were in direct line of fire when it came to being drafted and sent to the war. And as soon
Right.
as the war ended and they were no longer in danger of being drafted, all of a sudden, poof, that was the end of the
Right.
New Left. Like the New Left was very much about save my own skin from the war. Okay, there's some principle involved too. We don't want to fight in Vietnam. It's a bad war, Jane Fonda, and so forth. But as soon as the selfish desire to save
Right.
one's own skin was done, these students are not being drafted to fight for Israel or Hamas. They're protesting, whether you like it or not, whether one approves or not. One thing one can say is that the student protests on campus now are about the issue, not about I'm going to be drafted, so I'm burning my draft card.
Right. True. Although the protests following King's assassination, now those were about, on some campuses
Hmm,
that I detail, like at Duke, for instance,
sure.
those were about the issue of racial justice and
Yeah.
trying to get their universities. And to the extent there were a lot of different things going on at Columbia. Part of it was what you suggest exactly.
Hmm,
You know, young men who were draft age who were going to be drafted to this horrific war. But also, as you say, the issue had been about the gymnasium and about racial justice in that neighborhood
sure.
for a while. And King's death was the exclamation point on that sort of long running.
Exacerbated that. I just
Yeah.
want to
Further-
reintroduce you. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest is American historian and professor Jason Sokol. And Jason, who picks up his kids at the same school where I pick up my grandchildren, which is his actual claim to fame. We're both parental units and child caregivers. Um, and he's written a whole bunch of books. One is There Goes My Everything, White Southerners in the Age of Civil Rights. Another is All Eyes Are Upon Us, Race and Politics from Boston to Brooklyn. And then the one we're talking about today, The Heavens Might Crack, The Death and Legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., which has just come out in paperback with the University of Georgia Press edition. And I have found a lot of interesting things in Jason's books, which is, really well written and researched and about trying to have a true understanding of Martin Luther King Jr. now in the sense of how he impacted the future after his assassination. And of course, it opens the door to looking at a lot of things in the light of what's happening right now. And we just talked about one. Here's another. Because of King's support for democratic socialism in his last years, as well as his opposition to the Vietnam War, he faced a deepening enmity among white Americans. Overseas, however, such stances made him that much more of a hero. From England to Kenya, and on both sides of the Cold War, many global citizens had long seen King as their champion. And I think that quote, which is from page 151, also brings us back into the context of this talk today in just, again, looking at the contemporary American situation. And you can riff on this a little bit if you would, from two points of view. Again, how does King's life, death, and work affect us? Not how should it affect us or how have we missed the point of what he was really about, but in fact, how has it affected us? Whether that's misnomer about his legacy or not, how has it actually affected us? And what is the difference between how we look at King and how he's perceived in the non-political global environment where it's more just him as an individual and less what he
Hmm.
did to our country from a white point of view or a black point of view? I think those are two really
Right.
interesting ways to look at it.
Yeah, I think that thinking about the global king is really interesting because, as you say, then you're able to divorce him from the squabbles in America
Sure.
between the right and left. You're not talking about whether someone's for or against affirmative action, whether they're twisting the "I have a dream" speech.
Yeah.
In a way, talking about his larger, perhaps more meaningful legacy to the world.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, I think, which was one of the first um, public ways that the world embraced him as having this, recognizing him as having this global message
Hmm.
that went beyond Mississippi and Alabama and New York and Boston, right? So I think a lot of people who were fighting struggles, perhaps the most obvious would be in Africa, where they're fighting struggles for independence.
Sure.
They were looking at King um, as a hero, just as King was looking to them for inspiration. And
Yeah.
America, blacks in America were looking at that. He also had a deep tie with India because he had studied Gandhi's teachings, and there was this reciprocal relationship there. But I think then when he started to speak out against the Vietnam War, I think April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before his death. And he did this in a
Mm,
speech at the Riverside Church in New York City. And he talked about America as being the greatest purveyor of violence in the world.
mm, mm.
He really, as I said before, went from somebody who was explicitly a believer in the American dream to,
Sure.
as he said, somebody who saw an American nightmare.
Mm,
And so I think if you think about how those messages would land in, for instance, Europe, he was embraced. I mean, he was embraced. I mean, many in Europe saw the Vietnam War for what it was, this war of imperialism, colonialism that the U.S. should have gotten out of there, really. And King was one of the first prominent citizens in the U.S. to say that and to basically tell it like it is. So you had this interesting dynamic where because he was saying that in America, a lot of white Americans were turning against him,
mm,
calling him unpatriotic. And at the same time, he was being embraced in Europe. I mean, he took a trip to Newcastle. He flew to London, took a train all the way to Newcastle, all the way back, did that all in like 3 nights.
hmm.
Why did he do that? He didn't need another honorary degree from Newcastle. I think part of it is that the atmosphere in the US was so hateful in a way.
Mm.
And he was recognizing his own impact as a global citizen, his own so I think those are, is there anything in there that you want to talk more
Yeah,
about?
I mean, one thing jumped out of the book because it correlated with some of my own experience in that I was in British boarding schools, and I forget what year this occurred, but in your book, you talk about Enoch Powell, who is this British white, fiery, anti-immigration activist playing the race card there. So, of course, not everybody in Europe had this sort of enlightened view of King.
Right, right.
They would, and Enoch Powell was warning the British, actually using the same words that Trump used in a number of his speeches very recently, saying that if Trump doesn't get elected, there'll be a bloodbath.
Mhm.
Enoch Powell said the same thing about if we continue to let Black immigrants in from our former colonies, be that from India or the Caribbean or wherever, there will be a bloodbath. And he had a big following, a
Mhm.
following whose line, by the way, parenthetically, you can trace directly up to Brexit. Same crowd, same idea. And right now, I listen to BBC Radio 4 every day for news and read a couple British newspapers, and you find the British press is absolutely overwhelmed with stories about for instance, taking asylum seekers now who do get across the channel, again, mostly people of color, and shipping them off to Rwanda. They've
right.
done a deal with the Rwandan government. So the funny thing is, again, this thing about Enoch Powell in your book jumped out at me. And it's like, okay, it's again, same issue ripped from the headlines right now in the British media. And again, the whole Martin Luther King thing again, and I just pointing that out, just saying your book has a lot of relevancy to this moment of history in an odd way, which I think when you sat down to write it, maybe you didn't foresee that exactly, but it's weirdly topical.
Yeah, I mean, the only chapter that I knew for sure was going to always be relevant was the
Mm.
chapter about gun control because
Yes, and you've got that less than 2 hours before James Earl Ray aimed his rifle at the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. The Senate Judiciary Committee was debating proposals to regulate gun sales. That's actually in your book. I think it's page 191 or somewhere. Anyway, just to
right.
back you up, you got that in there.
I mean, but to respond to your point about Powell, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I was probably painting Europeans with too broad a brush by saying that King was universally welcomed there. And anti-immigrant politics. Um, in 1968 in America, there was all sorts of racist segregationist politics. But at that point, the anti-immigration issue was not the political hot button issue
Mm-mm.
here. There were other times in American history when it was, 1920s, for instance. But 1968, it wasn't. It wasn't here. But as you say, in the UK, that was a huge issue that
Mm-hmm.
Powell played on, and he gave this famous speech called the Rivers of Blood speech, right?
Yeah,
Just, I think that speech was just a week after King's assassination,
yeah.
and he referenced the race riots and uprisings in US cities as he said, this is what's going to come to the UK if we
Mm.
don't basically cap the number of immigrants, get rid of these these. So he was playing on these. It was interesting, you alluded to your friend in Paris. I mean, I think here in the US, a lot of us are very US centric. Not you, because you listen to BBC and you read the British newspapers.
Well, and I grew up in Switzerland and was raised over
Right,
there.
right.
So,
I think
this is not,
the
yeah.
extent to which the ferment of 1968 was worldwide, I think,
Hmm.
is easily missed by a lot of people. We can focus a lot on why did Nixon win or the assassination of King or Kennedy and think about US war in Vietnam. But as you know well, dozens of cities all over the world had all of these different student protests. I mean, in
Yeah,
Paris, the students and workers were forging a coalition that they thought was actually going to win,
yeah.
right? It was going to like make actual revolution, like
Mm.
full political revolution. So I think it was this amazing worldwide moment where in a lot of different um, places from, you know, Morningside Heights in New York to Paris and then to Prague and Mexico City and
Mm.
beyond. You had all these different student movements going on. I think it's important to emphasize that King was someone who was known in all those places.
Yeah, absolutely.
There were some figures who were just, only famous within their internal country
Hmm.
politics. And some of these revolutions had a lot to do with the internal politics of a single nation. I
Mm.
think King was known worldwide, and I think when he was assassinated, that was something that really resonated everywhere. And I
Mm.
try to point that out in the book too.
One thing about your book that's interesting to me is that um, because you're talking about a lifetime, where the demographic shift in the US and the rest of what's called the developed world, the white world, the European world, since the era in which your book covers, with the exception of maybe when you make some allusions to Obama and fast forward to that point, this is pre-demographic decline of white birth rates. So
Mhm.
the thing is, the white nationalists, Christian nationalists have this thing about, you will not replace us, whether it's to Jews or blacks or whomever. But of course, the Europeans right now are in a place that is distinct from the United States, where really our histories, it seems to me, have really diverged. And that is, yes, the same racism is there. European right-wing governments, Viktor Orban in Hungary, all the rest of it are playing on the same things. Obama, we've got a president of Russia who's attacking Ukraine to save the West and its values for Christian values. The Russian Orthodox Church backs him and so forth. So there's a lot of the same stuff going on that you can transpose from what white Christians were saying about King to now. But one thing that really is different with the is the demographics, and
Right.
that is that Korea, Japan, France, the European countries, the United States, when it comes to the white population, with the exception of religiously conservative groups of people, are definitely falling below replacement levels. Our southern border, it has a lot of people of color coming through it, but by and large, they actually are fervent, either evangelical or Roman Catholic Christians.
Mhm.
Europe now has North Africans pouring into France and now trying to get in boats and come to Britain. So not, Enoch Powell's version of Black people from the Caribbean coming really hasn't happened,
Right.
but Europe is actually facing a demographic crisis. And I wonder if, I'm just asking you this off the cuff, as somebody who does a lot of reading and thinking that I know you do you think the situation has changed a little in that sometimes the American left is too simplistic in seeing this all in racial terms? Because what's happening in Europe is a demographic crisis of the original population who are no longer reproducing themselves in sufficient numbers to actually maintain an economy. So they
Right.
either have to face opening their doors to immigration or not. And then the choice is dire. It's not a matter of principle anymore. It's absolute necessity if you want to maintain a modern economy. I know that's a long-winded thing, but they're in a very different position than we are because their southern borders have people coming from a completely different culture. And
Right.
these aren't Black Christians from the Caribbean. These are people from North Africa. And race is part of it, but I think the left can be very simplistic in thinking that it's only part of it. It's also a cultural dynamic that is really
Right.
challenging to people saying, hey, what kind of place are my kids going to grow up in now? And I think America and Europe are in a different position now.
Right. I mean, one thing is that the Democratic Party and liberals in the US made one big error in their predictions about the way the politics and race would go, which is for the last 10 or 20 years, there
Mm,
were these projections that the country was going to become this percentage Latino,
mm,
and the Democrats would have an obvious majority for decades to come.
yeah.
Where there, as you say, the people coming are evangelical Christians or Roman Catholics.
Mm,
They're not obvious Democratic voters.
no.
That was a huge error where the Democrats assumed that because they were non-white and because they were impoverished,
Hmm.
would obviously vote Democrat because Democrats obviously have better economic programs for people in need, and they also tend to have much fairer policies for people who are non-white. But that's not necessarily what these people are voting on. And if you trust the polls at all, the places where Biden is having trouble relative to his 2020 numbers, or he's
Hmm.
losing some Black voters, particularly Black men, and he's not doing as well among Latinos. And now he's also not doing as well among young voters, largely because of Israel Gaza. But
Yeah.
those first two are exactly what you're saying, is that thinking that it all boils down to race is not the right way for the Democrats to sort of build their lasting coalition. So I totally agree with that.
Yeah, and I think it goes to show that there is a hook, and be careful what you wish for if you want to build a world according to identity politics,
Right.
because this is, it's not, the cookie is not crumbling. And I think what's amazing about it is who's the Republican candidate? An out and out racist, literally a racist who has a long history far
Right.
beyond just the presidential politics, back to full page ads about the four guys in Central Park falsely accused of rape and attempted murder, and he wanted them put away forever and executed. His history of racism is so long. And yet, when it comes down to the cultural religious divide in America, you have Hispanics and some Black people who consider themselves church going conservatives now siding with Trump because they feel less alienated by him than they do by what they regard as, to use their phrase, the kind of demonic secular humanism of the American left.
Right.
You know, you're somebody who teaches American history. What the hell's going on?
Well, it is an element of this. The key to American politics is knowing who hates who. It's about, selling them. Some of these voters have been sold a bill of goods. I mean, New York Times just had a front page article about this Mexican American pastor in Texas who's claiming that you know, the autocrats to worry about it are the people on the left because they're
Mhm.
supposedly socialist.
Yeah.
These people don't see that there's a dictator waiting in the wings. I mean, that's what he said he wants to be.
Yeah.
That's what his enablers want him to be. There's no ambiguity there. So the
Mhm.
fact that so I think it is fairly ludicrous that you do have these segments of the population that are understandably alienated by the left for the reasons that you point out. But it's
Mm.
not understandable how they can go and think that the answer lies in Trump. I mean, you want to say the answer is someone else, Nikki Haley or some other version of Republican politics?
Mm.
Fine, that might make a certain sense to me. But how they could possibly pull the lever for the man that you describe his racism quite obviously. That is still fairly incredible. And I think some
Yeah,
of
it
it has
is.
to,
Yeah.
you don't have to say anything that's true anymore, though. Social media will amplify whatever lie, and people can vote based on that. There's also a segment of the population that doesn't get good information, I think, about the
Yeah, a very
candidates.
big segment. You have a quote. I'm going to quote a tiny little sentence out of your Morehouse talk. When did you give that? Just a couple of weeks ago. I know you came to the schoolyard and we were picking up kids, and you were saying you'd
Yeah,
just come back from Morehouse College.
so that was April 3rd, which was April 4th is the anniversary of King's assassination. So that was
Yeah, so that's what you were there
night
for.
before. Yeah.
You have a little quote that I want to pull out of that talk, which could have been taken from the book. So forgive me if it's in the book as well. But you say the upshot is, even in the summer of 1963, King's message was far more confrontational than many Americans now remember. Fast forward to the year 1967. It just seems that, a question that I have that I want to get to before we wrap this up here is just to ask you in terms of Martin Luther King Jr. himself,
Hmm.
um, as a leader and human. And I know this is a weird question here, hypotheticals are, but given so much of our history is repeating with white Christian nationalism now and the anti-immigration policies that they talk about, and that race is again a playing card, very complicated because there are conservative Black people, conservative Hispanics, religious people who are pushing for Trump unbelievably given who he is. But that said, if Martin Luther King Jr., you talk about, I think at the beginning of your book, you have this, somebody made a cartoon or an animated thing about a different King story. He survives, he lives, Oprah Winfrey winds up as president. It's this weird story in somebody's animated movie, but kind of riffing off that, if King were here now,
Hmm.
as Martin Luther King Jr., if somehow he were alive and present together, how do you, he was on a journey.
Hmm.
He was much more radical, I guess you could say, than people think because it's uncomfortable. How, if you're trying to actually apply the King legacy to this present moment and
Hmm.
all the complications with it, what is King saying to us now?
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting one and an important one and a hard one too. But I think it is, the first thing that I always remind myself, King was assassinated when he was 39.
Yeah,
I mean, all the things he accomplished by the age 39
yeah,
is really incredible, and he still had a lifetime in front of him. That's one of the great tragedies, I think, of his assassination, that he was
yeah.
not just that he was cut down so gruesomely
Hmm.
or cut down at all, but that he was cut down so young.
Yeah.
And that one wonders whether his voice could have guided the country and the world through
Mm.
all the things that were going to come, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the Nixon presidency, the continuing war in Vietnam, all these different things. And yes, up to today, what would he would, I mean, he wouldn't be 100 yet, his 100th birth, so he could conceivably still be with us in his
Yes.
90s. Um, I think, of course, he would look at the presidency of Obama and would think that some of what he had hoped for after the passage of the Voting Rights Act and his Selma March, he would think that some of what he had hoped for really had come to pass
Mm.
in giving African Americans that kind of political opportunity. Um, I think he would at once be shocked by the racial hatred and anti-immigrant sentiment that dominates so much of American politics. And he
Mm.
would, on the other hand, um, you know it quite well because King, like few others, he faced death threats daily,
Yeah.
basically, through his
Yeah.
entire life. And not just death threats, he was stabbed, he was beaten, he was thrown in the worst solitary confinement in this that Southern jails had for him.
Mm.
So he had tasted injury and brutality and death, and it was because of his race, and it
Mm.
was because of his messages. He was always um, he did always believe that there could be a multiracial America, that white and black and nowadays Latino and Asian American could come together. And I think he would hold out hope for some sort of democratic coalition that tried to knit those different sorts of people together. He also always believed in the right of civil disobedience. So I think
Mm.
looking at campus protests now, uh, I don't know what exactly he'd have to say about the politics of Israel and Gaza, but I sure know what he'd have to say about riot police arresting college students just for putting up tents.
Yeah.
Um, now there's a different issue if some of them are spouting violent anti-Semitism. That's a different thing. But I think, probably the thing that was most dear to King throughout his career was his belief in civil disobedience and the right to protest and put your
Mm.
body on the line, I think. I think that's I think he would on the one hand be heartened on how far America has come, but I think he would be shocked that
Mm.
here we are um, more than 55 years after his death, and here we have one half of the country rallying around a person who's talking in the most vile ways about immigrants or
Mm.
whites. I think that would really be um, shocking and upsetting to a person who had.
To him. Yeah, a few months ago we interviewed Teus Jackson Scott, who's the Chief Innovation Officer at Morehouse School of Medicine, and one of her big points was the disparity between the Black experience of American medicine, whether it's pregnant women and infant mortality or just anyone, and the white population and the rest of us. A lot of the people we've interviewed who have either written books or they're teaching at a place like Morehouse or someone within the Black community, have a very similar story about just the continuing double standards. So, I guess that, the final look at the Martin Luther King Jr. legacy is very much that this is, if at best, a work in progress, but at worst, we have gone backward.
Mhm,
And certainly the fact that Trump is running for a second bite at the presidency and the rise of this sort of militant Christian nationalist group and open carry weapons, the whole bit, it just seems to me that in one way it's deja vu all over again. We've seen this, and having been around in 68 when things were getting burnt down, but the threat of violence and disorder is now coming very much from the right wing.
mhm.
And, we've seen the Capitol stormed. I mean, you can only imagine if in 1968 a group of Black people had smashed into the Capitol, what would have happened to them.
Mhm.
now or then. So, final thoughts as a historian of American history, someone who writes on this, on just this kind of aspect of, King's legacy, but bookended by the disorder we see coming from the right and the violent threats coming from the right with a presidential campaign who talks about bloodbaths and mass
Mhm,
deportations. I don't think King could have foreseen this. I mean,
mhm.
would he ever have thought it could have gone this bad? And, how do you see that? And we'll sort of wrap up there a little bit, I think.
Right. I mean, these are the kinds of things that he had seen in Southern capitals throughout his
Mm,
life. The governor
mm,
of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, talking in these terms, governor of Alabama, George Wallace. But the fact that that kind of rhetoric belongs to a good 49 or 50% of the country, and
yeah.
that you not only have this one um, aspiring dictator who wants to win the presidency, you have a whole political party that has basically rallied around him and enabled him by failing to remove him from office after he was impeached,
Mm,
right? Right, giving him another shot to run again. Enabled now by the various judges, even the Supreme Court judges, who are failing to hold him to account
mm,
for, encouraging and whipping up the mob. So I think it is, those are the kinds of things that King knew intimately, but he knew them as like deep South politics. And the fact that half the country, I think, embraces that and amplifies that and valorizes it and romanticizes it. I mean, that is really the shocking part of the political moment that we're in, that these kinds of Jim Crow autocrats could rule the country and could be, given encouragement by even Supreme Court justices. So I think that, I think we're in a really dangerous moment for the country. Um, I would rather be living through it with someone like King at a, guiding us through,
mm,
um, and so forth. And, the point of my book was to look at what his loss meant for the country and the world
mm,
and how
mm.
people grappled with that at the time.
Well, and I think there is a difference between our era and his. Even the most backward and racist Southern politics, I don't remember George Wallace ever saying, if I run for president and don't win, I won't accept the election result.
That's true. Yeah.
I mean,
I
we've gone a step
Right.
further.
Well, I mean, all of those Southern politicians rigged the electorate to the extent that they did everything that they could to make sure black people couldn't vote.
Sure.
Um,
But they still paid lip service to the system.
they paid lip service to sort of the person who loses leaves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, we'll rig the system because we got to win this thing when we count the votes.
Right,
We're at a place now where why bother to rig the system? We just reject the result.
right.
Kind of another step.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So let me wrap up by just saying to people again what we've been doing here. I've been in conversation with my guest, American historian and professor Jason Sokol, and we've talked about a number of his books and a talk he gave at Morehouse, but we have been talking about The Heavens Might Crack, The Death and Legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., which is now out in paperback. And I would urge you to read the book and follow Jason's work. We will link to whatever you want us to link to, Jason. What do we link to for you in terms of
Oh,
like,
in terms of buying the book.
yeah, I mean, we'll do all that. We will give
Okay.
the thing to click on Amazon, all the rest of it. But is there any site that you would like people to link to if they want to be in touch with you or ask more questions or whatever it might be? Do you have something that you're doing online? Or are you smart and stay off of that?
They can go to jasonsokol.com if they want to know more about my books and my writings. All of it is collected there, and or they can go to my website at UNH, and they can find my email address there if they want to get in touch
Good.
with
Well,
me.
we'll link to those things. Ernie, Greg, our producer, who puts all this together, will make sure we linked all that. This has already gone out live, and then it'll show up in a lot of different social media places, plus The YouTube thing will still be there, and Facebook, and all the good things we do. And then, of course, there's a podcast, and we'll send you all those links as well, so that you can then hopefully give those to people who you would like to have listen to this as a way to promote your work on top of that.
Great. Well, thanks so much for, uh, well, I'm so happy we had the chance to talk for more than just a couple minutes.
Yeah, me too. And the other thing is, I won't see you today because my
Okay.
granddaughter is on a camping trip, and so there's no school pickup, but I'm going to my grandson's
Okay.
lacrosse match. So we won't be able to high five about the interview. We'll wait for tomorrow.
See you tomorrow then.